This will be the first of many addendums to Cryptic Archive File number 4 about vampires. Let me introduce to you the story of the Anantis Castle Vampire. In this document, I plan to expand on the story of the Anantis Vampire. I do cover it summarily in my original vampire file, which I'll link below, but here I wish to read the entire text for you as well as further discuss certain details of the story. This tale was originally recorded by William of Newburgh during the 12th century in his book Historia Rerum Anglicarum, or The History of English Affairs. William was a chronicler of events and compiled the history of England until his death in 1198. He only took the accounts of people he felt were reliable and respectable individuals. Before I read you the text from his book, I'd like to address the common misconception about the story, whereas it's usually referred to as the Alnwick Castle Vampire. The first time I heard the narrative, it was called as such, and across YouTube you can find many videos making the same error. Even though the misnomer is well known, the actual name of the town in the story was Anantis, not Alnwick. The reason for this confusion was a man named Montague Summers, who in 1929 wrote a book called The Vampire in Europe. In it, he presented William's tale, and as far as anyone can tell, was the first one to identify this story as potentially being about a vampire. He was also the person responsible for changing the location to Alnwick Castle. I found a wonderful article on a website called Anomalies. In it, the author says, and I quote, "It's hard to know if Summers translated William's account himself or worked from Stevenson's well-known translation, but in both cases, Summers is the first person to claim the castle was called Alnwick, so he's to blame for all accounts that came after claiming there was a vampire at Alnwick Castle. The only guess I can make on why this happened is that Summers, also stymied by the odd name Anantis, instead looked around for the closest castle to Yorkshire that started with the letter A, and Alnwick was top of the list. To this day, there are books and websites claiming Alnwick Castle was home to a vampire, but there's no actual proof it ever was. We can get back into deciphering the location where this tale took place a little later, but for now I would like to read the actual text from William's book, as it was translated from Latin. It might be difficult to understand a direct reading because people spoke in a much different manner back then in the 12th century. I consider myself a rather verbose person with a large vocabulary, and even I had to look some of these words up. After each major segment, I'll try to help summarize and explain the more confusing elements. So let's begin. Another event also, not unlike this, but more pernicious in its effects, happened at the castle which is called Anantis, as I have heard from an aged monk who lived in honor and authority in those parts, and who related this event as having occurred in his own presence. A certain man of evil conduct, flying through fear of his enemies, or the law, out of the province of York, to the lord of the before-named castle, took up his abode there, and having cast upon a service befitting his humour, laboured hard to increase rather than correct his own evil propensities. He married a wife, to his own ruin indeed, as it afterwards appeared, for, hearing certain rumours respecting her, he was vexed with the spirit of jealousy. Anxious to ascertain the truth of these reports, he pretended to be going on a journey from which he would not return for some days. But coming back in the evening, he was privily introduced into his bedroom by a maid-servant, who was in the secret and lay hidden on a beam overhanging his wife's chamber, that he might prove with his own eyes if anything were done to the dishonour of his marriage bed. Thereupon, beholding his wife in the act of fornication with a young man of the neighbourhood, and in his indignation forgetful of his purpose, he fell, and was dashed heavily to the ground, near where they were lying. There are definitely some perplexing concepts here, so let me dive into it. For one, it's not clear to me why the monk considered the new arrival to Anantis to be a man of evil conduct. To say such a thing, I'd have to figure there would be some reason for it. To be a man of evil conduct, he would have had to act the part. I would expect that the man's actions would have had to be pretty awful in order to be considered evil. Then again, this occurred around 1196, so who is to say what might have been considered evil back then by someone who served God? It is odd, though, and it makes me wonder what the monk saw him doing that affected his opinion so. He also talks about how the man labored hard to increase his evil propensities, which is to say he didn't hold back whatever negative behavior he was exhibiting in the first place. and in fact kept engaging in more indecent acts. It's also interesting to note that when he says the lord of the castle gave him a job befitting his humor, William is talking about the man's health, or his ability. Back then, people referred to humors when discussing health matters. It was basically a medical system they used to explain all matters that affected the body and even the mind, using 4 different types of liquids from the human body: the blood, phlegm, yellow bile, and black bile. So in this case, befitting his humor likely meant that he was given a job he could manage in his current condition. It's possible that he had some sort of health problem or an impairment, but more likely that he was simply saying he was given a job he could perform. Another thing I find strange is that this man has a maidservant. Doesn't it sound weird? I'd think they were peasants without much wealth, but yet he has a servant? It's never made clear what exactly the man does for a living though, but the servant definitely hints at some additional wealth. Besides that, the story continues on that the unnamed man took a wife who he soon hears rumors about in the village. Rumors that she is cheating on him. So in order to catch her, he tells her he's going out of town, and instead of leaving, sneaks back into the house and hides on a crossbeam above her bedroom. He catches her sleeping with another man and gets so upset that he can no longer control himself and falls hard to the ground. Now let's continue with the text. The adulterer himself leaped up and escaped, but the wife, cunningly disassembling the fact, busied herself in gently raising her fallen husband from the earth. As soon as he had partially recovered, he upbraided her with her adultery and threatened punishment, but she, answering, "Explain yourself, my lord," said she. "You are speaking unbecomingly, which must be imputed not to you, but to the sickness with which you are troubled. Being much shaken by the fall, and his whole body stupefied, he was attacked with a disease, insomuch that the man whom I have mentioned as having related these facts to me, visiting him in the pious discharge of his duties, admonished him to make confession of his sins, and receive the Christian Eucharist in proper form. But as he was occupied in thinking about what had happened to him, and what his wife had said, put off the wholesome advice until the morrow. That morrow which in this world he was fated never to behold. For the next night, destitute of Christian grace, and a prey to his well-earned misfortunes, he shared the deep slumber of death. A Christian burial indeed he received, though unworthy of it, but it did not much benefit him, for issuing, by the handiwork of Satan, from his grave at night time, and pursued by a pack of dogs with horrible barkings, he wandered through the courts and around the houses while all men made fast their doors, and did not dare to go abroad on any errand whatever from the beginning of the night until the sunrise, for fear of meeting and being beaten black and blue by this vagrant monster. But those precautions were of no avail, for the atmosphere, poisoned by the vagaries of this foul carcass, filled every house with disease and death by its pestiferous breath. So the Anantis man has fallen pretty hard. He probably hit his head and he's laying on the floor. His wife is thinking she can use his addled state to her advantage and get out of the fact that she had just been caught cheating. She helps him up and tries to spin a yarn, lie her way out of it. He's not having any of it though, and he upbraids her, or scolds her for her adultery. She says he's speaking unbecomingly, which means not the most appropriate or polite, but then says it shouldn't be attributed to him, but to the sickness he's been troubled with. I think this is speaking to his injuries from the fall. It is possible that he may have had a pre-existing condition that was exasperated by the fall, but likely from the context, it's that his drop is to blame for what happened to his health afterwards. The text says his body was stupefied, which tells me he either couldn't move properly because he was injured, or he hit his head so hard that he could not control his body. He is in such bad shape that the monk who recounts the story to William is summoned to the house. The monk sees the dire condition the Anantis man is in, and fearing he may soon die, the monk pleads with him to make confession of his sins. The man is having none of it, though. He's too caught up in trying to figure out whether or not his wife actually cheated on him and trying to cope with the horrible injuries he's received and what's going to happen to him. He ends up going to sleep and never wakes up, dying in his bed. The monk opts to give the man a Christian burial, and this is where it starts to get weird. Not long after the burial, the man starts to rise from his grave at night, followed by a pack of barking dogs. The monk says he wandered through the courts and around the houses, while everyone locked their doors and stayed inside. But even though they hid, he says the air became poisoned by his foul, dead body and filled every house with disease and death. It's important to understand that people back then didn't know much about how diseases were transmitted. So they thought for a while that bad air, specifically called miasma, was responsible for epidemics and that it came from rotting matter. Understanding that makes this portion of the text make a lot more sense to us in the present day. It certainly doesn't explain why he was said to rise from his grave with a pack of dogs, but it does explain why they thought his rotting corpse was poisoning the air. With that said, let's continue. Already did the town, which but a short time ago was populous, appear almost deserted, while those of its inhabitants who had escaped destruction migrated to other parts of the country, lest they too should die. The man from whose mouth I heard these things, sorrowing over this desolation of his parish, applied himself to summon a meeting of wise and religious men on that sacred day, which is called Palm Sunday, in order that they might impart healthful counsel in so great a dilemma, and refresh the spirits of the miserable remnant of the people with consolation, however imperfect. Having delivered a discourse to the inhabitants after the solemn ceremonies of the holy day had been properly performed, he invited his clerical guests together with the other persons of honor who were present to his table. While they were thus banqueting, 2 young men, brothers, who had lost their father by this plague, mutually encouraging one another, said, "This monster has already destroyed our father, and will speedily destroy us also unless we take steps to prevent it. Let us, therefore, do some bold action which will at once ensure our own safety and revenge our father's death. There is no one to hinder us, for in the priest's house a feast is in progress, and the whole town is as silent as if deserted. Let us dig up this baneful pest and burn it with fire." So, by now the town, which had been quite well populated before, now appears to be deserted. Many who escaped death simply left the village. The monk telling the story relates to William how his parish, or his church, has become desolate, or that barely anyone comes to church anymore, likely because they've died or moved on. He plans a meeting on Palm Sunday, inviting wise men as well as his fellow clergy in the hopes of cheering up what remained of the village's people. The monk holds the Palm Sunday ceremonies and gives the townspeople a pep talk to the best of his ability. Afterwards, he invites his guests of honor to a big feast, leaving the rest of the congregation to their own devices. It's very likely that many of them weren't satisfied with whatever words the monk used to explain away their misfortunes. And that is when a young man, whose father had died to the plague, makes a speech to those still assembled. The speech is very straightforward. He basically says if we don't get rid of this monster, he'll destroy the rest of us. He implores the people to come with him to the cemetery so that they might dig up the Anantis man and burn his body. The next segment is the conclusion to the story. Thereupon, snatching up a spade of but indifferent sharpness of edge, and hastening to the cemetery, they began to dig. And whilst they were thinking that they would have to dig to a greater depth, they suddenly, before much of the earth had been removed, laid bare the corpse, swollen to an enormous corpulence, with its countenance beyond measure turgid and suffused with blood, while the napkin in which it had been wrapped appeared nearly torn to pieces. The young men, however, spurred on by wrath, feared not and inflicted a wound upon the senseless carcass, out of which incontinently flowed such a stream of blood that it might have been taken for a leech filled with the blood of many persons. Then, dragging it beyond the village, they speedily constructed a funeral pile, and upon one of them saying that the pestilential body would not burn unless its heart were torn out, the other laid open its side by repeated blows of the blunted spade, and thrusting in his hand, dragged out the accursed heart. This being torn piecemeal, and the body now consigned to the flames, it was announced to the guest what was going on, who, running thither, enabled themselves to testify henceforth to the circumstances. When that infernal hellhound had thus been destroyed, the pestilence which was rife among the people ceased, as if the air which had been corrupted by the contagious motions of the dreadful corpse were already purified by the fire which had consumed it. These facts having been thus expounded, let us return to the regular thread of history. And that is the end. So, the brothers, likely accompanied by many others from the village, grab shovels and head to the cemetery and dig up the body of the Anantis man. There is mention that the grave is much more shallow than they expected, which probably lent credence to them that the corpse must have risen. But it's not clear to me how deep graves were typically dug back then, and none of these people were gravediggers, so how would any of them know? In trying to find an answer myself, I found it to be widely variable, ranging from a shallow scoop in the ground to a pit that's a meter deep. I'd say it ultimately doesn't have a lot of bearing on this man being an undead vampire one way or the other. When they uncover his body, they say it's swollen to an enormous size, and then describe its countenance. It's important to note that countenance is usually used to describe the face specifically, and William says it's beyond measure turgid and suffused with blood. Turgid means swollen and distended, and suffused with blood is to say that blood was spread pretty heavily under the skin, making it appear quite red. Think of when someone blushes, for instance, and their cheeks become pink. The young men then stab the corpse, and a heavy stream of blood flows out. There is also the colorful reference of the body being easily mistaken for a leech filled with the blood of many persons. They rip the man's heart out through his ribcage and tear it to pieces. Then they construct a funeral pile and burn the body upon it. This very action seems to cleanse the bad air from the contagious corpse, purifying it by fire, and that is the end of the story. Now, most of the story can likely be explained away as superstition, but there are some elements that give me pause. Questions I can't answer, and likely never will be able to. For one, how did they know that the Anantis man had risen from his grave and was harassing villagers' homes at night? There's never a description of what the risen man looked like, but I would hope that someone must have seen him in order to say it was him that was actually the culprit. That, or they just assumed it must be him because he had recently died, but never left their homes to look. The pack of dogs is also a strange addition because I have to figure that even the monk himself must have heard this. It leads me to wonder if it was a once-off occasion or if it happened quite regularly. This is probably the most intriguing aspect of the entire story in regards to the Anantis man being a vampire, or at least some sort of undead creature. But without further information, there is simply no way to come to a solid conclusion. Another thing I'd like to know is what plague befell the village, since it happens in accordance with the death of the Anantis man, and for this reason he is blamed for the disease. It is thought that this story was written in the short time before William's death, between 1196 and 1198. I found myself curious what specific disease they could have been referencing and took to looking into it. It's frustrating that they never once reference any actual symptoms in the story, besides contagion and death, because it gives me little to go on. The Black Death, or the bubonic plague, ran rampant across Europe from 1346 to 1353 and resulted in a 30 to 50% mortality rate. The bubonic plague didn't reach England until 1348, which is 150 years too late to be our culprit. There are definitely earlier accounts of plague, but it's difficult to know if it's the same plague, since the culprit responsible for bubonic plague, the bacterium Yersinia pestis, wasn't discovered until 1894, and it wasn't linked to plague until 1944. It also seems probable that plague could have been used as a descriptor for any epidemic-level disease that took out large amounts of the population, and there were many such diseases like leprosy, smallpox, tuberculosis, sweating sickness, influenza, dysentery, and so on. It is difficult to research, though, considering any time you do a search in modern times, plague is associated with the now known plague bacteria. Another interesting element from the story that I'd like to talk about is the state of the Anantis man's corpse. when the villagers dig him up. It is very descriptive for once, and so it gives us a lot to go on, even though it doesn't give us the exact dates and times. Now, given they don't dig the man up until the village is in a state of devastation, I think it's fair to say that it's been quite some time since the man has died. Who's to say exactly how much time has passed, and how long it would take someone to die of the mystery disease they all had? I think it's safe to approximate anywhere from 2 to 4 weeks, so that's the likely time frame that we're working with. Imagine many of the townspeople would have to have gotten sick and consequently died before they actually exhumed his body. Now, let's talk about human decomposition so that we can understand whether his body was in a normal or abnormal state when they found him. There are many stages to decomposition, and because this often relates to the misunderstanding of a corpse's state in vampire accounts especially, I think ultimately I'll make a separate video describing every stage. For this file's purposes, though, only stage 2 is relevant because it is the only stage that our Anantis man's corpse matches. Stage 2 is the state of bloat. It occurs between 3 to 5 days after death. During this period, the decaying body begins to produce a lot of gas. This gas can cause the body to double in size, which would explain why the Anantis man's corpse was described as swollen and massive. Sulfur compounds from the bacteria can also cause green skin discoloration. Around 8 to 10 days into decomp, the body turns from green to red as the blood decomposes further and gas continues to accumulate in the abdomen. This sounds just about perfect for the body in the story, doesn't it? The only problem I have with it is that I doubt it would be possible for all of this to occur within 8 to 10 days. That's really a small window for all of these events to happen. But there could be other explanations, perhaps a delay in the corpse's decomposition. Climate could most definitely have affected the rate of decomp, especially if the temperature was very cold. A dry, hot climate could reduce a cadaver to bones within a few short weeks, while a cool, marshy environment could take months to reach the same state. We know that his body was buried somewhere around Palm Sunday. If we take a look at an Easter date table, it says Easter would have fallen on March 24th in 1196. Palm Sunday would have been a week before that, and the Anantis man's death would have been even farther before that, likely falling within the 2 to 4 week range that I suggested. They didn't use a Gregorian calendar as we do today, but given that an average Julian year was 365.25 days, and an average Gregorian year is 365.2425 days, it's not going to be that far off. We're already dealing with not knowing when the Anantis man died, too, so we just have to accept the margin of error here. Still, if you consider that he died at least a month before his corpse was exhumed, then it could have been as early as February 17th when the Anantis man was buried. And that could also explain his shallow grave, because the ground would have been frozen. The very act of burial also slows decomposition significantly, since it deters flies from laying their eggs in the body, as well as protecting it from a host of other bacteria that would otherwise make a home there. So it's very likely that there was absolutely nothing wrong with the man's corpse. The time frame does seem off at first, but only until you take all of these other factors into consideration. With all of that said, there is one last thing to discuss, and that's the location where this story took place. If you recall, at the beginning of the video, I explained how the tale had been changed by a man named Summers from the Anantis Castle Vampire to the Alnwick Castle Vampire. Now, the Alnwick Castle actually exists. It's located in Northumberland, 116 miles from the town of York. But Anantis Castle, or even a town by the same name, does not exist in the United Kingdom. The man responsible for the original translation in 1856, Joseph Stevenson, proposed that William was speaking of the town of Annan in Scotland, which would have been 133 miles away from York, England. The town did have a castle at the time, too, that was owned by the Bruce family. but it has since fallen to ruin. So there you go. I believe I've covered everything that I set out to and created a thoroughly comprehensive script of the Anantis man's tale. I did try to keep it as accurate as was possible, but given the extreme age of this text, it wasn't an easy task. Still, I feel I've explained away most all of the strangeness from this narrative, besides the notion of his rising from the grave at night with a pack of dogs. It's definitely odd and the one thing that makes this story hold together, but there is never a mention of people's blood being consumed, besides when the man's corpse is described, and compared to leeches. William's tale was incredibly fascinating to dig through though, and I enjoyed myself immensely. I'm sure those who stuck around for the whole video have learned a thing or two that they didn't know before as well. So please keep an eye out for more vampire stories from history that will be showing up soon on the Cryptic Archive channel. I have many other stories about personal and paranormal experiences I've dealt with over on my Patreon too, so please consider signing up if you're interested in hearing about them. It really helps me to keep the channel going too, considering starting out is notoriously difficult on YouTube. Every time I post a new video here, I post a new story on Patreon as well, so definitely check it out if you're interested in supporting the channel. The Patreon link is in the info below, and you can pledge any amount you desire. Thank you so much for watching. Please like and share the video if you've enjoyed it, and most importantly, don't forget to subscribe. Vampire File Addendum 1 on the Anantis Castle Vampire. Complete.